For more than 3,000 years, a staircase lay hidden beneath the dust and debris of Egypt's Valley of the Kings. Above it, generations of archaeologists searched for the tombs of pharaohs. Ancient robbers had already entered most of them. Their treasures had disappeared, their chambers had been damaged, and many believed that the valley had little left to reveal. Then, in November 1922, everything changed. British archaeologist Howard Carter and his Egyptian excavation team uncovered the entrance to a forgotten tomb. The seals on its doors carried the name of a young pharaoh who had almost vanished from history, Tutankhamun. When Carter finally looked through a small opening into the darkness beyond, the light from his candle revealed shapes slowly emerging from the shadows. Golden objects, strange animals, statues, chariots, furniture, boxes stacked almost to the ceiling. It was not an empty royal tomb. It contained thousands of objects that had remained hidden for centuries. The discovery would transform Tutankhamun from a little-known king into one of the most famous figures of the ancient world. And the story of how his tomb was found was only beginning. The extraordinary thing about the discovery was that Tutankhamun had not been one of Egypt's greatest rulers. He did not build the largest pyramids. He did not conquer a vast empire. He did not rule for decades. Tutankhamun became pharaoh while still very young, probably around 9 years old, during Egypt's 18th dynasty. His reign lasted less than a decade. He lived during a difficult period in Egyptian history. The religious and political order of the kingdom had recently been transformed by Pharaoh Akhenaten, who promoted the worship of the Aten and reduced the importance of many traditional gods. During Tutankhamun's reign, this process began to reverse. Traditional temples and cults were restored. The young king even changed his name from Tutankhaten, which referred to the Aten, to Tutankhamun, connecting his identity with the god Ammonius. But before he could establish a long reign, he died while still a teenager. Later rulers rarely celebrated him. His monuments were altered. His name became less visible. Ironically, that disappearance from history may have helped preserve the one thing that would eventually make him immortal: his tomb. By the beginning of the 20th century, the Valley of the Kings was already one of the most famous archaeological sites on Earth. For hundreds of years, travelers, collectors, treasure hunters, and scholars had entered its tombs. Some chambers had been open since antiquity. During the 19th century, archaeology became more organized, but the search for spectacular objects often remained intense. One royal tomb after another had been identified. By the early 1900s, American archaeologist Theodore Davis held the excavation concession for much of the valley. His teams uncovered several important tombs and objects connected with the final years of the 18th dynasty. They also found traces carrying Tutankhamun's name. To many observers, this suggested that his burial had already been destroyed or emptied. Davis eventually believed the Valley of the Kings had been exhausted. Howard Carter disagreed. He examined the known discoveries and noticed something important. Evidence of Tutankhamun existed, but nobody had found a convincing royal tomb belonging to him. Somewhere beneath the ground, Carter believed, there might still be one final major discovery. Finding it would require money, patience, and years of difficult work. Howard Carter did not begin his career as a wealthy scholar or university professor. Born in England in 1874, he had a strong talent for drawing. As a teenager, that skill helped him find work in Egypt, where archaeologists needed accurate copies of paintings and inscriptions from ancient tombs. Carter learned archaeology in the field. He studied ancient art, architecture, excavation methods, and the landscape of Egypt itself. Over time, he gained greater responsibility and became an inspector for the Egyptian Antiquities Service. His career was not always smooth. After a dispute involving tourists and Egyptian guards at Saqqara, Carter left his official position. For several years, he supported himself partly through painting and guiding visitors. But he never abandoned archaeology. His detailed knowledge of the Theban necropolis eventually brought him into contact with a wealthy English aristocrat named George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon. It was a partnership between two very different men. Carnarvon could provide the money. Carter could provide the experience. Together, they would spend years searching for something that many other archaeologists believed was no longer there. George Herbert, Lord Carnarvon, had money, curiosity, and a growing fascination with ancient Egypt. After a serious automobile accident, he began spending winters in Egypt, where the warmer climate was better for his health. Archaeology soon became more than a hobby. Carnarvon financed excavations around Thebes and began building a collection of Egyptian antiquities. In 1909, Howard Carter started working with him. The partnership proved effective. Carter was methodical and experienced. Carnarvon was willing to finance long excavation seasons. When the opportunity arose to search the Valley of the Kings, they focused increasingly on the missing tomb of Tutankhamun. But archaeology was expensive. Workers had to be paid. Equipment had to be purchased. Huge quantities of debris had to be removed. Season followed season without the great discovery Carter expected. For Carnarvon, the search became increasingly difficult to justify. By 1922, after years of disappointing results, he was ready to stop financing the project. Carter persuaded him to fund one final season. It was a decision that would change both of their names forever. The Valley of the Kings lies on the western side of the Nile, across the river from ancient Thebes, near modern Luxor. During Egypt's New Kingdom, many pharaohs abandoned the tradition of building enormous pyramids for their burials. Instead, workers cut royal tombs deep into the limestone hills. The location provided natural isolation, while the hidden entrances were meant to make the burials harder to find. Inside, corridors led toward chambers decorated with religious texts and images describing the king's journey through the afterlife. But secrecy failed. Ancient thieves entered many royal tombs. Gold, jewelry, furniture, and other valuable materials were easy targets. Even some royal mummies were eventually moved by Egyptian officials to protect them from further destruction. By Carter's time, the valley was covered with evidence of thousands of years of activity. Tomb entrances, ancient workmen's huts, spoil heaps, and debris overlapped one another. That complicated the search. A tomb could exist almost directly beneath the remains of later activity. And that was exactly the type of place where Carter intended to look. Carter's systematic search of the Valley of the Kings began in 1917. His team cleared large areas down to the bedrock. This was slow work. Tons of stone, sand, broken pottery, and debris had to be moved by hand. Carter believed the most promising area lay near the tomb of Ramesses VI. But there was a problem. Ancient huts built by workers from a later period covered part of the ground. Removing them would disrupt access to a tomb that was already popular with visitors. So that small area remained largely untouched while Carter investigated other locations. Year after year, the results were disappointing. There were minor discoveries, fragments, and clues, but no royal tomb of Tutankhamun. To an outsider, the search could easily appear hopeless. Carter saw it differently. The lack of a tomb did not prove that Tutankhamun had never been buried in the valley. To him, it meant that the correct patch of ground had not yet been cleared. By 1922, almost everything depended on returning to that one overlooked area. By the autumn of 1922, Carter knew this might be his final opportunity. Lord Carnarvon had agreed to finance one more excavation season. Carter returned to the Valley of the Kings with a clear target. The workers' huts near the tomb of Ramesses VI would finally be removed, allowing the ground underneath them to be examined. Excavation began at the start of November. There was no guarantee of success. For years, Carter had been following small clues left behind by ancient people and earlier excavators. Now his entire theory depended on a relatively small section of ground. The team began clearing the area. Almost immediately, something appeared beneath one of the huts. It was not gold. It was not a statue. It was not an inscription. It was the top edge of a step cut directly into the rock. More debris was removed. Another step appeared. Then another. A staircase was descending beneath the surface. On November 4th, 1922, Howard Carter finally knew that they had found an ancient entrance. But he still did not know whose tomb waited at the bottom. The excavation team continued down the staircase. 16 steps were eventually uncovered. At the bottom stood a doorway blocked with stone and covered with plaster. Its surface carried ancient seal impressions. The site was promising, but also confusing. Some of the seals were connected with the royal necropolis rather than one specific king. Carter also noticed evidence that the entrance had been disturbed in antiquity. Perhaps robbers had already entered. Perhaps the chamber beyond had been emptied thousands of years earlier. Then more of the doorway was exposed. Among the impressions, Carter's team identified a royal name: Tutankhamun. For years, Carter had searched for the king. Now his name was appearing on the entrance directly in front of them. Carter resisted the temptation to continue immediately. Lord Carnarvon was still in Britain. The doorway was secured and the staircase was temporarily filled again for protection. Carter sent a telegram. He had finally found something extraordinary, and he wanted his patron in Egypt before the tomb was opened. For Carter, the waiting must have been difficult. He had spent years searching for Tutankhamun. Now a sealed entrance bearing the king's name had finally appeared, and he could not yet explore what was behind it. Lord Carnarvon received Carter's message in England and prepared to travel to Egypt. His daughter, Lady Evelyn Herbert, accompanied him. They arrived in Luxor on November 23rd. The excavation resumed. The staircase was cleared again, and the team returned to the first doorway. On November 25th, they opened it. Instead of a chamber filled with treasure, they found a descending corridor packed tightly with limestone chips and rubble. That was still encouraging. A completely open passage would have suggested extensive ancient robbery. The team began removing the fill. As they worked forward, they discovered traces of tunnels made by ancient thieves. Someone had entered this place before. The question was what they had left behind. After clearing roughly 9 meters of passage, another sealed doorway emerged from the darkness. This was the barrier that stood directly between Carter and the answer. The second doorway looked remarkably similar to the first. It carried seals associated with Tutankhamun and also showed signs of ancient interference and resealing. Carter now faced two possibilities. Beyond the wall might be another corridor or chamber already emptied by thieves. Or it might contain the royal burial he had spent years trying to find. On November 26th, the team carefully made a small opening in the upper part of the doorway. Warm air escaped from the dark space beyond. Carter inserted a candle. At first, he could see very little. As his eyes adjusted, individual shapes began to emerge. The room was not empty. Objects filled the space. Some were covered in gold. There were couches shaped like strange animals, chariots, boxes, furniture, statues. The objects had been placed so closely together that the chamber appeared almost frozen in ancient chaos. Lord Carnarvon waited behind Carter. According to the famous account, he finally asked whether Carter could see anything. Carter's answer became one of archaeology's best-known phrases. Yes, wonderful things. What Carter saw was unlike anything he had encountered before. The chamber, later called the antechamber, contained an extraordinary mixture of royal possessions. There were dismantled chariots, ceremonial beds, chairs, stools, boxes, weapons, vessels, clothing, and objects covered in gold. Some appeared to have been thrown out of position. Ancient thieves had entered the tomb not long after Tutankhamun's burial. They searched through parts of the chamber, probably looking for small and easily carried valuables. But for reasons we still cannot fully reconstruct, the tomb was resealed. Most of its contents remained behind. That made the discovery exceptional. Other royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings had suffered centuries of robbery and disturbance. Here, Carter was looking at something much closer to a complete royal burial assemblage. But the antechamber was only the beginning. Between two life-size black statues stood another sealed entrance. Behind it, Carter suspected, lay the king himself. Opening that door could not be rushed. Every object in the first chamber had to be photographed, numbered, recorded, stabilized, and carefully removed. What looked like the end of a long search was actually the beginning of an excavation that would continue for roughly a decade. The antechamber was the first room Carter and his companions could see, and it immediately showed why the tomb was so unusual. The chamber was crowded with royal possessions. Gilded couches stood beside dismantled chariots. Painted chests, stools, vessels, weapons, flowers, and ceremonial objects filled almost every open space. Some pieces were stacked on top of others, while smaller objects had been moved from their original positions. This disorder was partly ancient. Soon after Tutankhamun was buried, thieves entered the tomb. They searched through boxes and containers, probably looking for small valuables that could be carried away quickly. Egyptian officials later resealed the entrance, but they did not restore every object to its original place. For Carter, this created an enormous problem. He could not simply walk into the room and begin removing treasure. Many objects were fragile after more than 3,000 years. Wood had dried, textiles had weakened, and decorated surfaces could break with a careless touch. The antechamber, therefore, became a carefully controlled archaeological workspace. Each object had to be photographed, numbered, described, stabilized, and then removed in a planned order. What looked like a room full of treasure was also a complex record of an ancient royal funeral. Off the antechamber was a smaller room that Carter called the annex. It was even more crowded and confused. Objects had been packed into the space with little room between them, and ancient robbers had disturbed many of the containers. The annex contained items that reveal the practical side of a royal burial. There were baskets, jars, boxes, pieces of clothing, oils, food supplies, small pieces of furniture, and equipment intended for the king's life in the next world. Sandals and other personal objects appeared beside ceremonial material. Some containers had been opened in antiquity, while others still held their contents. To modern viewers, these objects can seem less dramatic than gold coffins or the famous mask. For archaeologists, however, they were extremely valuable. A royal tomb was not prepared with a few symbolic treasures. It was supplied with an entire collection of things believed to be useful after death. The crowded condition of the annex also made excavation difficult. Removing one object could expose another underneath it. Weak baskets, textiles, and wooden pieces needed support before they could be lifted. Every small discovery added detail to the picture. Tutankhamun's tomb was becoming more than a royal burial. It was becoming an unusually complete collection of objects from the world in which the young king had lived. The discovery created worldwide excitement, but Carter's team could not work at the speed demanded by newspaper headlines. The tomb had survived for more than 3 millennia. A rushed excavation could destroy evidence in a matter of hours. The team created a detailed recording system. Objects received numbers. Their positions were noted. Drawings and plans recorded how rooms and groups of objects related to one another. Notes described materials, damage, decoration, and the steps used during removal. Photography was especially important. Harry Burton, working for the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Egyptian expedition, produced an extraordinary photographic record of the excavation. His images show objects before they were moved, workers handling fragile pieces, and the changing appearance of the rooms as they were slowly cleared. Conservation often had to begin inside the tomb. Fragile wood, leather, textiles, and painted surfaces could not simply be carried into the sunlight. Some pieces were strengthened before transport, then taken to a nearby laboratory for further treatment. This methodical work explains why clearing the tomb took years rather than weeks. The goal was not merely to collect beautiful objects. Carter's team was trying to preserve their archaeological context. Those photographs and records remain important today because they allow researchers to reconstruct where objects were found and how the burial had been disturbed long before 1922. As the antechamber was cleared, attention increasingly focused on 2 life-sized black statues standing against one wall. Each represented the king, dressed in royal form and holding a staff. Between them was another blocked and sealed doorway. The statues created one of the most memorable scenes in the tomb. They seemed to stand like guards before the part of the burial that had remained hidden from Carter's first view. By February 1923, enough material had been removed from the antechamber for the team to approach the sealed partition safely. Carter, Lord Carnarvon, and their colleagues knew that the chamber beyond could contain the king's actual burial. The opening was made carefully. Once the wall was breached, they did not find an empty room. Instead, an enormous gilded structure appeared almost immediately beyond the doorway. It filled most of the chamber. This was the outermost of several nested funerary shrines built around Tutankhamun's sarcophagus. Its scale changed the character of the discovery. The antechamber contained a remarkable collection of possessions. The room beyond contained the protected center of the burial. The partition had to be enlarged and portions of the surrounding structure removed before work could continue. Layer by layer, the team was moving closer to the young pharaoh himself. The room beyond the sealed wall became known as the burial chamber. Unlike the crowded antechamber, its purpose was unmistakable. This was the space constructed to hold Tutankhamun's body. The walls were covered with painted scenes connected with death, rebirth, and the king's journey into the afterlife. The decoration was less extensive than in many other royal tombs, a fact that may reflect the speed with which the burial had to be prepared after Tutankhamun's unexpected death. But almost all the available floor space was occupied by a huge gilded shrine. Beyond it were more layers of protection surrounding the sarcophagus. The chamber also contained objects linked directly to royal funerary ritual. Protective symbols, ritual equipment, vessels, and divine figures surrounded the burial. The arrangement was designed to protect the dead king both physically and spiritually. For the excavation team, the restricted space created a technical challenge. The shrines could not simply be pushed aside. Each structure had to be documented and dismantled in sequence, with very little working room between the shrine walls and the painted chamber walls. The deeper Carter moved into the burial, the more deliberate the work became. Every layer concealed another. The tomb was revealing its central secret slowly, one barrier at a time. Tutankhamun's burial was protected by 4 large wooden shrines placed one inside another. Their surfaces were covered with gold and decorated with religious texts and images. The outer shrine was so large that it nearly filled the burial chamber. Inside it stood a second shrine, then a third, and finally a fourth. Doors, seals, cloth coverings, and ritual objects marked the transitions between these layers. For ancient Egyptians, these were not simply expensive boxes. The shrines created a sacred protective enclosure around the king. Their decoration called on gods and magical forces to defend Tutankhamun and help him pass safely into the afterlife. Removing the shrines required careful planning. Sections were heavy, fragile, and difficult to maneuver in the confined chamber. Carter's team photographed the doors and seals before opening them. Panels, roof sections, supporting frames, and textile coverings were recorded as they came apart. The process took months. Each removed layer increased the tension because the excavators knew they were approaching the sarcophagus. Yet the work also revealed how much labor ancient craftsmen had invested in a burial for a king whose reign had been short. The nested shrines turned the center of the tomb into a sequence of protected spaces. At the very heart of that sequence stood a large stone sarcophagus. When the last shrine was opened, Carter's team finally confronted the stone container that protected Tutankhamun's coffins. The sarcophagus was made primarily from quartzite and covered by a massive lid. At its corners, protective goddesses extended their arms around the royal burial. Their presence transformed the stone box into something more than a physical container. It was part of a religious system intended to guard the king for eternity. Lifting the lid was a major engineering task inside an already crowded chamber. Heavy equipment had to be positioned carefully so the stone could be raised without damaging the sarcophagus, the chamber, or the contents below. Around this central burial were other objects connected with the king's transformation after death. Canopic equipment protected the internal organs removed during mummification. Divine figures and ritual objects reinforced the magical protection surrounding the body. When the lid finally rose, the excavators did not see the mummy. Inside the stone sarcophagus was another human-shaped container. And inside that one were still more layers. Tutankhamun had been placed within a sequence of coffins, each shaped in the form of the king. The discovery now moved from architecture and shrines to something far more personal, the royal body, and the objects placed directly around it. Inside the sarcophagus were 3 anthropoid coffins nested one inside another. The outer coffin presented Tutankhamun as an ideal king, with crossed arms and royal emblems. Beneath it was a second coffin, richly decorated and inlaid. When that layer was removed, the third and innermost coffin appeared. It was made of gold. The progression was extraordinary. The excavators had already passed through doors, 4 gilded shrines, and a stone sarcophagus. Now another sequence of protective layers surrounded the mummy itself. The coffins were not identical. Their decoration, materials, and details differed, but all presented the king in a transformed, eternal form. The face was youthful and calm. Royal insignia connected Tutankhamun with kingship, while divine imagery linked him with the gods of the afterlife. Separating the layers was difficult. Ritual resins and oils used during the burial had hardened over the centuries, bonding parts of the funerary equipment together. Historical photographs show the slow process of exposing each coffin and recording what appeared beneath it. Then the innermost coffin was opened. Inside lay Tutankhamun's wrapped mummy. Covering his head and shoulders was the object that would eventually become the most recognizable image from ancient Egypt. Tutankhamun's funerary mask became the symbol of the discovery. Made primarily of gold and decorated with colored inlays, it covered the king's head and shoulders. The striped royal headdress frames an idealized face. On the forehead appear the cobra and vulture, symbols associated with royal authority over Upper and Lower Egypt. The mask was not intended as a realistic portrait in the modern sense. Egyptian funerary art presented the dead king in an eternal and perfected form. Its purpose was connected with identity, protection, and rebirth. Yet the craftsmanship is immediately understandable even without knowing the religious meaning. Gold surfaces, blue glass, and stone-like inlays, carefully shaped features, and small decorative details create an object designed to command attention at close range. The mask was only one element among the jewelry and protective objects associated with the burial. Amulets, collars, rings, pectorals, and other ornaments carried religious symbols intended to protect different parts of the body and assist the king in the next world. That larger context matters. The mask was spectacular, but it was part of a carefully planned funerary system. During the 20th century, photographs of it spread around the world. More than any other object from KV-62, it turned Tutankhamun into a global visual icon. Beneath the funerary equipment lay the mummy of the young king. Examining it was difficult from the beginning. Large quantities of ritual oils and resins had been poured over the burial. Over time, some of this material hardened and helped bond the mummy to the innermost coffin. In 1925, Carter's team and anatomist Douglas Derry examined the body. Their methods reflected archaeological and medical practice of their own period, but some of the procedures would be considered too invasive today. The examination recorded physical details and removed objects placed within the wrappings. Dozens of amulets and pieces of jewelry had been positioned around the body. Bracelets, collars, protective symbols, and other objects were documented layer by layer. Later generations of researchers used less destructive technology. X-rays and CT scans allowed specialists to examine the mummy without repeating the methods used in the 1920s. These studies have produced evidence about Tutankhamun's health and physical condition, but they have not turned every question into a certainty. Claims about exactly how he died have changed repeatedly as new evidence has been interpreted. The mummy, therefore, remains important for 2 reasons. It is the body of a historical king, and it also shows how archaeological methods have changed during the century since the tomb was discovered. The golden mask dominates popular images of Tutankhamun, but the tomb contained an enormous range of other objects. There were chariots, bows, arrows, walking sticks, ceremonial staffs, shields, daggers, jewelry, fans, statues, and ritual equipment. Some objects were clearly symbolic. Others could have been used during the king's lifetime. The chariots are especially important. Different examples appear to have served different purposes, from ceremonial display to practical movement. Their surviving parts show sophisticated woodworking, leatherwork, and decorative techniques. Weapons also reveal the royal image expected of an Egyptian pharaoh. Bows, arrows, shields, and blades presented the king as a hunter and warrior, even though Tutankhamun's short reign gives us limited evidence for his personal military experience. One famous dagger contained an iron blade, a remarkable material for Egypt at this time. Other weapons and ornaments combined gold, stone, glass, wood, and imported materials. The quantity of craftsmanship concentrated in a single burial is difficult to grasp. Each object required specialists, raw materials, organization, and time. Together, the treasures show that KV-62 was not simply a container for gold. It preserved technology, art, royal symbolism, and evidence of the networks that supplied Egypt's court during the late 18th dynasty. Some of the most revealing objects from Tutankhamun's tomb are not the most famous. The burial contains sandals, gloves, pieces of clothing, beds, chairs, stools, boxes, containers, walking sticks, game equipment, and food provisions. There were objects connected with grooming and personal care, as well as practical items made from wood, leather, linen, pottery, stone, and plant material. These things bring the young king closer to ordinary human experience. A pair of sandals was made to be worn. A chair supported a person. A game was meant to be played. Containers once held food, drink, oils, or cosmetics. Walking sticks could carry ceremonial meaning, but the large number found in the tomb has also encouraged questions about how frequently Tutankhamun used them in life. Even preserved plant material can tell researchers about funerary rituals, seasons, and the natural resources available to the royal court. The tomb therefore works on two levels. It presents Tutankhamun as a divine king surrounded by gold and religious protection, but it also preserves traces of clothing, furniture, recreation, food, and daily routines. That combination is one reason the discovery remains so valuable. KV-62 did not preserve only the image of a pharaoh. It preserved fragments of a real household and a real life more than 3,000 years ago. By the time Howard Carter opened the tomb, Tutankhamun had been dead for more than 3,000 years. Yet the objects buried with him preserve a surprisingly personal picture of a king who died before reaching adulthood. Tutankhamun was born during the final years of the 18th dynasty, one of the most powerful periods in ancient Egyptian history. He came to the throne as a child, probably around 9 years old, and ruled for roughly a decade. That meant much of the government around him was managed by experienced officials, priests, military commanders, and advisors. His short reign left fewer monumental records than those of rulers such as Amenhotep III or Ramesses II. Even so, his surviving inscriptions show a kingdom trying to restore stability after a period of religious upheaval. The treasures from his tomb also reveal the world expected of a pharaoh. There were bows, chariots, staffs, ceremonial clothing, gaming boards, furniture, jewelry, food, and objects connected with worship and the afterlife. Some were made specifically for his burial. Others seem to have been adapted from earlier royal possessions. This is why Tutankhamun matters beyond the gold. His tomb preserved evidence of court life, craftsmanship, religion, warfare, clothing, food, and royal ceremony in a way that almost no other Egyptian royal burial has done. The famous boy king was not remembered because he ruled for a long time. He was remembered because, by extraordinary chance, so much of his world survived with him. To understand Tutankhamun, we have to begin with the crisis that came before him. A generation earlier, Pharaoh Akhenaten had attempted one of the most dramatic religious changes in Egyptian history. Traditional Egyptian religion recognized many gods, supported by temples, priesthoods, estates, festivals, and rituals that had developed over centuries. Akhenaten placed extraordinary emphasis on the Aten, represented as the sun disk whose rays ended in small hands. He changed his own name from Amenhotep IV to Akhenaten and founded a new royal city at Akhetaten, the site now known as Amarna. The royal court moved there. New temples were built in open spaces where sunlight could reach the altars. Images of the king, Queen Nefertiti, and their children appeared beneath the rays of the Aten. Egyptian art also changed. Royal bodies were shown with unusual proportions, and scenes of the royal family could appear more intimate than earlier official art. But the transformation created disruption. The position of Ammonius and other traditional gods was reduced, and names and images connected with Ammonius were attacked in some places. When Akhenaten died, the political situation became uncertain. Several rulers or royal figures appear in the complicated years that followed, and the exact sequence remains debated. Then a young king named Tutankhamun came to the throne. He inherited an empire, but he also inherited the consequences of a religious experiment that had challenged some of Egypt's oldest institutions. The central task of his reign would become restoration. Tutankhamun's family is one of the most debated parts of his story. Akhenaten's great royal wife, Nefertiti, was one of the most prominent queens in Egyptian history. At Amarna, she appears repeatedly beside the king, participating in worship, royal ceremonies, and scenes with their daughters. For many years, historians tried to fit Tutankhamun into this family using inscriptions, artistic evidence, damaged names, and the identities of royal mummies. A major DNA study published in 2010 proposed that the mummy from tomb KV55 and the so-called younger lady from KV35 were Tutankhamun's father and mother. The same study interpreted the KV55 individual as Akhenaten. Those findings became highly influential, although the identification of some royal mummies and the interpretation of ancient DNA continued to be discussed by specialists. What is clear is that Tutankhamun belonged to the Amarna royal world. His wife, Enkhsenamun, had earlier been called Enkhsenfetun. She was a daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, which tied the young couple directly to the previous royal family. Images from Tutankhamun's burial equipment show the king and queen together in unusually gentle scenes. She offers him flowers, touches him, or stands close beside him. We cannot know how closely these images reflected their private relationship. They were royal art, created within Egyptian conventions. But they give the story a human scale. Behind the famous mask were teenagers living inside a court shaped by succession problems, religious conflict, and a royal family whose exact relationships are still being reconstructed today. The young king did not begin life with the name the world knows today. His early name was Tutankhamun, meaning the living image of the Aten. It connected him directly with the religious system established by Akhenaten. Within a few years of his accession, that changed. Tutankhamun became Tutankhamun. His queen, Enkhsenfetun, became Enkhsenamun. The new name signaled a return toward Ammonius and the broader traditional religious order. A major inscription known as the Restoration Stela describes temples that had fallen into neglect and gods whose sanctuaries required repair. The text presents the king as restoring what had been damaged and returning divine order to Egypt. In practice, a child king could not have managed such a transformation alone. Senior officials, priests, and administrators were deeply involved. The policy also served a practical purpose. Restoring temples meant restoring large institutions that controlled land, workers, wealth, and political influence. The royal court moved away from Akhetaten. Memphis again became an important center of government, while Thebes remained central to the cult of Ammonius. Old religious imagery returned. Building projects were restarted. Statues and monuments celebrated traditional gods. Some monuments made under Tutankhamun were later taken over by his successors, especially Horemheb. Names could be replaced, and ownership of royal works could shift. This helped reduce Tutankhamun's visibility in later history. But during his own reign, the direction was clear. The Aten Revolution was being reversed, and Egypt's older religious institutions were returning to the center of public life. Tutankhamun may have worn the crown, but the political world around him included older and more experienced figures. His queen, Enkhsenamun, shared the royal stage with him. Their images appear together on objects from the tomb, most famously on the Golden Throne, where the queen stands before the seated king beneath the Aten's rays. Two senior men became especially important near the end of the reign. The first was Ai. He held high court titles and appears to have been an influential official during the Amarna period and under Tutankhamun. After the young king died, Ai became pharaoh. In Tutankhamun's burial chamber, Eye is shown performing the opening of the mouth ceremony for the dead king, a role that also advertised his position in the succession. The second was Hormheb, a powerful military commander. He later became pharaoh after Eye and presented himself as a restorer of order. This sequence matters because Tutankhamun left no surviving son who could inherit the throne. Two small mummified fetuses were discovered in his tomb. They are generally understood as daughters associated with the royal couple, although their exact medical and genetic history remains the subject of research. After Tutankhamun's death, Enkhsenamun largely disappears from secure Egyptian records. A famous group of Hittite texts describes an Egyptian queen who asked the Hittite king to send her one of his sons because her husband had died and she did not want to marry a servant. Some scholars identify that queen with Enkhsenamun, but the identification is not certain. Tutankhamun's death therefore opened a dangerous political gap at the heart of the dynasty. Tutankhamun's early death has inspired almost a century of theories. He was probably around 18 or 19 years old when he died. For a young pharaoh, that immediately raises a question. What happened? Earlier writers sometimes imagined murder. Damage to the skull seen on old X-rays was once interpreted as possible evidence of a fatal blow. Later CT examinations showed that some of this damage was more likely connected with mummification or the handling of the body after death. Modern imaging has revealed other problems. Tutankhamun had abnormalities in his left foot, and evidence suggests he may have suffered from a painful bone condition. The large number of walking sticks found in his tomb became especially interesting in this context, although ceremonial staffs were also normal royal objects. The 2010 medical study reported genetic evidence associated with malaria parasites. It also described a fracture of the left leg that may have occurred close to the time of death. Researchers proposed that malaria, injury, and underlying health problems could have combined to weaken him. But that is not the same as proving a single cause of death. Ancient remains are difficult to interpret. DNA preservation, contamination, changes caused by mummification, and damage after burial can complicate every diagnosis. So the safest answer is also the least dramatic. We do not know exactly how Tutankhamun died. What we do know is that his death came unexpectedly early. His burial appears to have been prepared under time pressure, and that sudden death may explain several unusual features of the tomb that Carter would uncover more than 3,000 years later. The greatest mystery of KV-62 may not be why it was robbed. It is why so much remained. Ancient thieves entered Tutankhamun's tomb at least twice, probably not long after the burial. They disturbed boxes and carried away portable valuables. Egyptian officials then resealed the entrance. Later, the tomb effectively disappeared. Its position helped. KV-62 was small and cut low in the valley floor. It lay close to the much larger tomb later made for Ramesses VI. Debris from later construction accumulated above the area, and workers' huts were eventually built over part of the entrance. That activity was disastrous for Carter's search, but excellent for the tomb's survival. Later robbers could pass through the valley without realizing that another royal burial lay underneath their feet. Tutankhamun's relative obscurity may also have helped. Later kings reused or erased some of his monuments, and his name was omitted from important king lists. A famous tomb is easier to hunt for than the burial of a ruler who had faded from official memory. By the 20th century, excavators had worked all around the area. Yet the small patch beneath the huts remained. This combination of ancient resealing, later debris, geography, and historical forgetfulness protected an enormous archaeological time capsule. The tomb was not perfectly untouched. That popular description is misleading. But compared with almost every other royal tomb in the Valley of the Kings, it was astonishingly complete. Its survival depended on a chain of accidents. And in November 1922, that chain finally ended when Carter's workers uncovered the first step. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb quickly produced a second story, one that had very little to do with archaeology. The curse. Lord Carnarvon died in Cairo on April 5, 1923, only months after the tomb was opened. He had suffered an infected mosquito bite that was worsened by shaving. The infection developed into serious illness, with blood poisoning and pneumonia reported in accounts of his final days. To newspapers, the timing was irresistible. Stories spread that disturbing the pharaoh's tomb had triggered an ancient punishment. Later deaths connected, sometimes very loosely, with people who had visited Egypt were added to the legend. The tale grew with every retelling. There was one major problem. No famous warning promising death to anyone who entered Tutankhamun's tomb was found on the doorway. And many of the people most closely involved lived for years afterward. Howard Carter, the man who actually opened and worked inside the tomb, lived until 1939. Researchers have even tested the legend statistically. A historical cohort study published in the British Medical Journal found no evidence that exposure to the supposed curse shortened the lives of the people involved. The curse survived because it was a perfect newspaper story. It combined a dead king, hidden gold, mysterious rituals, sudden death, and a public already fascinated by Egypt. For historians, it is useful for a different reason. It shows how quickly an archaeological discovery can acquire a mythology of its own, until the invented story becomes almost as famous as the evidence beneath it. Long before television or social media, Tutankhamun became a global celebrity. News of the discovery traveled rapidly through newspapers, illustrated magazines, newsreels, lectures, and photographs. Readers wanted every new detail from the Valley of the Kings. Harry Burton's photographs were especially important. His carefully lit images allowed people thousands of kilometers away to see the objects almost as Carter's team encountered them. The public fascination soon moved beyond archaeology. Egyptian-inspired patterns appeared in jewelry, clothing, advertising, theater, architecture, and interior design. The discovery arrived at a moment when Art Deco was developing and ancient Egyptian forms could be adapted into modern geometric designs. The king's name became commercially valuable. At the same time, the enormous media attention created tension at the excavation. Access to the tomb had to be controlled, journalists competed for information, and political questions about who owned Egypt's antiquities became increasingly important. Egypt itself had formally declared independence from Britain in 1922, although British influence remained substantial. The tomb therefore became part of a wider debate about archaeology, national heritage, and foreign control. The treasures did not simply belong to a romantic story of explorers finding gold. They were Egyptian cultural heritage. That distinction became more important as the excavation continued. Tutankhamun's fame was created by archaeology, photography, newspapers, and modern mass culture all at once. A ruler who had been nearly forgotten in antiquity became one of the first archaeological superstars of the modern age. The importance of Tutankhamun's tomb was not only the value of its objects. It was the record created while those objects were removed. The antechamber looked chaotic when first opened. Furniture overlapped. Fragile materials had deteriorated. Some objects had been disturbed by ancient robbers. Simply pulling out the most spectacular pieces would have destroyed information. Carter's team instead spent years documenting positions, assigning numbers, making notes, drawing plans, photographing objects, carrying out conservation, and preparing them for transport. Harry Burton's photography became one of the defining records of the excavation. Specialists were brought in to work with textiles, botanical remains, metals, human remains, inscriptions, and conservation problems. By modern standards, some methods and interpretations would be handled differently today. Archaeology has continued to change. But the scale of documentation at KV62 was exceptional for such a complex early 20th century excavation. There is also another part of the story that modern histories increasingly recognize. Egyptian workers performed much of the difficult excavation labor. Local knowledge, foremen, conservators, guards, and officials were essential to the project, yet many were poorly identified in publications and popular accounts. Understanding the discovery today means looking beyond the image of one British archaeologist with a candle. KV62 was the work of a large team operating within the political realities of colonial-era archaeology. Its surviving records now allow researchers to return to the excavation digitally, recheck object locations, compare photographs, and ask questions that Carter himself could never have imagined. A century of research has answered many questions about Tutankhamun, but it has also created new ones. His exact parentage remains discussed, especially because identifying damaged royal mummies is difficult and ancient DNA work presents unusual technical challenges. The identity of the individual buried in KV-55 remains particularly important because it affects how the entire Amarna royal family is reconstructed. Tutankhamun's cause of death is also unresolved. Malaria, a leg injury, congenital conditions, and other health problems have all been investigated, but no single explanation has closed the case. Scholars continue to debate the political sequence around the end of Akhenaten's reign. Names such as Smenkhare and Nefertiti appear in evidence that is incomplete and sometimes difficult to date. Even the events after Tutankhamun's death are uncertain. Was Ankhesenamun the Egyptian queen who wrote to the Hittite king asking for a foreign prince? The possibility is compelling, but it cannot be treated as proven. The tomb itself has generated new questions. Radar surveys and studies of its walls have repeatedly raised the possibility of additional spaces nearby, although claims of hidden chambers have not produced a confirmed new royal burial. And thousands of objects from KV-62 still contain information. Improved imaging, materials analysis, conservation science, and digital reconstruction can reveal manufacturing techniques and alterations that were invisible to early excavators. Tutankhamun is therefore not a solved mystery. The tomb gave archaeology an extraordinary collection of evidence. The challenge now is to separate what that evidence actually tells us from the attractive stories we want it to tell. When Howard Carter first looked into the antechamber, he could not have known what the discovery would become. The excavation produced more than 5,000 catalogued objects, from monumental gilded shrines to tiny beads, food containers, clothing, tools, toys, weapons, and personal ornaments. Together, they preserve an unusually detailed record of an Egyptian royal burial. But Tutankhamun's legacy reaches far beyond the objects. The tomb transformed public interest in ancient Egypt. It inspired generations of archaeologists, museum visitors, artists, filmmakers, writers, and students. It also changed the boy king himself. In his lifetime, Tutankhamun was a young ruler navigating the aftermath of Akhenaten's revolution. He died before he could build the long record expected of a great pharaoh. In later Egyptian history, his name became obscure. Then archaeology reversed that fate. Today, his face is recognized around the world, largely because of the golden mask placed over his mummy for a burial never intended to be seen again. The objects continue to be conserved, studied, and displayed in Egypt, while archives of Carter's notes and Burton's photographs allow researchers to reconstruct the excavation in extraordinary detail. The most important lesson is not that Tutankhamun possessed gold. It is that history can survive in unexpected places. A forgotten staircase beneath workers' huts led to a sealed doorway. Behind it was a young king, a royal court, a religious crisis, an ancient burial, and thousands of objects waiting to speak again. More than 3,000 years after Tutankhamun died, the discovery of his tomb still gives us new questions. That is why the world has never stopped looking inside.